Welcome, everyone, to this Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma conversation for journalists and any other friends and colleagues who are in the room. I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. We're all here today to talk with Dr. Judith Herman, MD, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and known to many of us I know in this room for so long as the author of Trauma and Recovery, a pioneering work that did for the aftermath, for social understanding of the aftermath of violence and trauma, something like what Silent Spring did for pesticides. Really reshaped the worldview of anyone who read it. She's part of a pioneering generation that first defined psychological trauma as we understand it today, but then has always gone one step further and insisted on looking at the role of social inequity, of social context, in both the experience of violence and trauma, the perpetration of it, but also in recovery and healing for survivors. We're here to talk about Judith Herman's wonderful and powerful new book, which you can get on Amazon without all the yellow stickies in it. Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. This is as powerful, and I believe in the long run will be as influential a book as Trauma and Recovery. It invites us to imagine, along with Judy, a distinct stage of recovery that goes beyond the traditional realm of psychology, which is justice, as she defines it, which repairs not only the individual psychic wound, but rather the whole violation of the social contract that happens when the triangle, which I'm sure we'll talk about, of victim and perpetrator and bystanders is part of the equation. A lot of the issues that we'll talk about are deeply relevant to the world we're in right now at this moment, where issues of accountability for atrocity, where issues of gender violence and the Me Too movement, issues of climate justice are all on the equation. But we're here as the Dart Center, which tries to nurture innovative and ethical reporting on survivors of violence, because a lot of the issues that Judy raises in Truth and Repair are actually deeply relevant to journalism practice and to how we think about our work. Issues of listening, of storytelling, of the meaning of accountability, the very purpose of telling survivor stories into the public realm, something that I know is a big concern to a lot of us here in the room. Before I get to the conversation, there's a couple bits of housekeeping. First of all, for everyone here, if you're interested in finding out more about the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, visit our website, www.dartcenter.org. This is in webinar format, which is unfortunate. It means we can't see people's faces, but it does allow a lot more of you to participate in this conversation. Because it's webinar format, we will be taking questions in the chat through the Q&A function. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see Q&A. And by all means, as we go on, and particularly a little bit later in the conversation, feel free to throw questions into the chat, which my colleague Zan Strumfeld, who is kind of on the board here, will be helping us curate. We are also recording this, not just for posterity, but for the Dart Center's YouTube channel, where it will eventually appear and probably live as long as there's an internet. And we also have turned on closed captioning, which you can control using the show captions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I invite you to use any of those features. And finally, I do want to specifically acknowledge three people who are helping make this possible today. Kate Black, Zan Strumfeld and Crystal Grow, all of them part of the Dart Center's team at Columbia University. Judith Herman, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I want to start out with a question that may lead us into framing the whole discussion. I don't know. We'll see. If you go to any psychiatry or psychology conference about trauma these days, which I'm actually doing a little bit later this week, you hear a lot of cool stuff, right? You will hear about epigenetics. You will hear about neurotransmitters. You will hear arguments about definitions and diagnoses. You'll hear about psychedelics. There's all kinds of interesting stuff out there. One word that I can't remember the last time I saw it on a trauma psychiatry or trauma psychology program is this word justice. And yet you have kind of centered it. It's really the operative word in this whole long title, Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. What are you as a mental health professional and in a field of trauma that has come to be dominated on the one hand by a lot of science, which is good, and by a call for a lot of individual healing and stuff, which is also good. Why justice? Why are you centering the conversation there?
Well, if you look beyond neurobiology and genetics and really understand that trauma is as much a social problem as a psychological and biological problem. If you recognize that interpersonal violence is a crime, and so that most of the trauma that our patients experience originates in an injustice, then healing isn't just a matter of biology and individual psychology. It's also a matter of repairing the harm that was done with the crime. And that brings us to the questions of social justice.
And essentially, I think what you're asking us to consider is a lot of kinds of violence, but in particular gender violence and sexual violence, which we'll talk in more detail about in a few minutes. But you're asking us to think about not only the individual act of perpetration, but the violation of the social contract. And in your work as a clinician, how have you come to see, why is that the fourth stage of recovery in your framework? You previously had articulated a very powerful model of 3 stages for trauma survivors' recovery, which has become very influential. You're throwing justice into the equation. How does that become operative?
I think it becomes operative actually from the get-go, because when you're talking about interpersonal violence, you're not just talking about a victim and a perpetrator, but also about the bystanders. And often when you're actually working through the trauma with patients and giving patients an opportunity to tell their stories and to make meaning and grieve what happened, their sense of grief and betrayal is often more profound about what the bystanders did or didn't do than even what the perpetrator did. When I got into this work, talking with incest survivors, and oftentimes the biggest question was, where was my mother? And the biggest grief was, why didn't she protect me? And so that's on a very private, individual scale. If you're working with Holocaust survivors on a mass murder scale, oftentimes the same question came up. Where were the bystanders? Where were the people who knew and could have intervened and didn't? And that betrayal, where was God?
Yeah.
And that betrayal was often felt more profoundly than even the cruelty of the perpetrators.
Yeah. And I think that will lead us in thinking about repairing that into some very challenging questions. And we should say, of course, content warning, I suppose, that this whole conversation is going to necessarily involve asking difficult questions about difficult experiences. And any of you who are here in the room, take care of yourselves as we do this conversation. You chose, though you've worked with many different kinds of survivors over many years, you chose to focus your research in this book specifically on survivors of sexual violence and gender-based violence. And in defining the terrain at the beginning, you spend a lot of time actually talking about patriarchy as a model for tyrannical systems. Talk a little bit about why you chose to focus there in asking, what does justice mean?
Well, there were really two reasons for that. One is very personal, one's very general. The personal reason is that's the population I've worked with throughout my career for the most part. I came of age during the second wave of women's liberation. I was in a consciousness raising group at the same time as I began my psychiatric residency, and really being part of that movement enabled me to listen to my patients with a whole other perspective. Kathy Amatniak, who changed her name to Kathy Sairchild, was a classmate and friend of mine, and she had been a civil rights volunteer in the Deep South during Freedom Summer in 1964. And she had seen there what happened when you brought people together to tell their stories. And she saw consciousness raising not only as a method of political organizing, which it surely was, and not really as therapy, although it surely was, but as a method of scientific inquiry. Because she said the textbooks are not going to tell you anything about women's lives. And it's true. The comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, when I was training, estimated the prevalence of all forms of incest at 1 case per million. So what were the odds that, my first week on a psychiatric patient service, I would see 2 incest survivors, right? So something was not computing. And, with the women's liberation movement behind me, I actually had, the gumption to write about it. Yeah. So, and by the way, our first, when Lisa Hirschman and I published our first paper on father-daughter incest, we had collected 20 cases just by asking around among a few other clinicians. We didn't publish it in a psychiatric journal. I don't think any psychiatric journal would have published it. We published it in a New Women's Studies journal, so QED. But now we have good worldwide epidemiology on gender violence. We have a special rapporteur in the United Nations that collects data from countries all over the world. And we have pretty good evidence that violence against women and children is probably the most common human rights and the most enduring human rights violation in the world. Mm-hmm. So I chose patriarchy as a model of tyranny because you see it worldwide, you see it on every level, from intimacy of families to the worldwide sex trade. And you see it in war, as a method of conquest. So I chose that as a prototype, but my argument is that the same reasoning, the same logic can be applied to any deeply ingrained system of dominance and subordination, whether that's based on race, on caste, on class, on religion, you name it.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that. But I also wanted to talk to you a little bit now at the beginning about your method. This is a very interesting, methodologically interesting book. First of all, we should say that it's the product of 20 years work. As you outlined, you worked on this for many years under sometimes difficult circumstances. But in some ways you were, in your method, as much a journalist as a therapist. That is to say, you did a kind of interviewing of 26, I think it is, survivors that is a little different from what you would usually be doing as a clinician. Talk a little bit about what your method was, how you're channeling the voices of survivors. You're not just saying, here's what Judith L. Herman thinks about the world. You have a different kind of purpose here, which in some ways is close to the work that some of the folks in this room do.
Well, yes, the methodology was semi-structured interview. And my sample was 30 people, 26 women and 4 men, who had been survivors of sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, physical abuse, sex trafficking, as children or adults. They were all adults. They were, it was a convenient sample. It was not a random sample. I just kind of put out the word, anybody who wants to talk with me. And they were all people also who were not in the acute phase of crisis phase after a recent trauma. They'd all had enough time to get their lives stabilized and to reflect on the impact of the trauma and on and I asked them basically, what would make things, if you could write the script, if you had control of the justice system, what would make things right, or as right as possible for you? Mm-hmm. What would you want? And by the way, the other thing that was non-random about my sample is more than half of them had actual experience with the justice system, either the civil or the criminal side. So they had filed reports or filed complaints, and encountered the justice system and in person, that's a much higher percentage than, for sexual assault, for example, the average percentage of survivors who complain to the police is maybe in the 20% plus or minus. But so 50% having made a complaint is not representative. Yeah. And also 6 of them, so 20%, had actually gone through the whole criminal process to a conviction and a prison term for the offenders. And again, that is a much, much, much higher percentage. I mean, again, for sexual assault, the estimated, once you have the attrition within the justice system, how many cases are closed by arrest, how many cases are prosecuted, and so on, you're down around 0 to 5%.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It
in that
struck
sense, people knew what they were talking about, many of them.
Yeah, it struck me also, and I don't know if you know the number on this, but some significant percentage of your interviewees had encounters with the media, good and bad. You talk about a woman in, I think it is Minnesota, who decided to tell her story to the press and had disappointing results from the community in that. You've had, how much did going public through media or press channels figure into your conversations?
I'm trying to think about what percentage had gone public. I can't think offhand. It's certainly not the majority. I can only think about two or three who actually were interviewed by the press at the time. But a couple have since told their stories in public as well.
Yeah, I can think of one of your folks in the Boston area who is very visible there.
Kate Price, who has a book coming out. She did a long interview with the Boston Globe. She's a survivor of sex trafficking and incest, and now a scholar in residence at Wellesley, I believe, and she has a book coming out.
Yeah, that lengthy Boston Globe profile of her won this year's Dart Award, and I would encourage anyone in the room who's interested to take a look at it. You can link to it through the Dart Center's website, among other things. So you're doing these interviews, which again are a little bit different from what you would normally do as a clinician. Maybe thinking about both sides from your experience interviewing, but also from your years of working with survivors. Let's talk about interviewing for a minute. When someone does decide to be part of the public act of storytelling that's involved in trusting a academic researcher, trusting a journalist, whatever, what's at stake when interviewer and survivor meet? What's going on there from the perspective that you've brought to this work in this book?
Well, I think this is, you can conceptualize this as an act of seeking justice from the community, from the bystanders, and what people want, based on what my informants told me. They want, first of all, acknowledgement. They want acknowledgement of the facts and also of the harm that was done. And they also want vindication. They want bystanders to say this should not have happened. This was wrong. They want the shame to be lifted from their shoulders and the blame to be lifted from them and placed where it belongs, on the perpetrator. So they don't want somebody asking, well, how many drinks did you have and why did you go to that party and what were you wearing? You know, so they are risking that kind of shaming and blaming from the wider public. And And that really, that is what often survivors describe as a second rape.
Yeah.
So the journalist can't really be neutral.
Mhm.
This is not a sort of a let's both sides, or he said, she said, let's do an interview with the perpetrator and and give voice to his argument. Well, she was a slut, she asked for it. That is certainly not, I think, what victims are hoping for if they're trusting a journalist. But I think they have, in terms of preparing people for what they might encounter, I think we have to warn people that we can report their story, but are they prepared for the fact that they may get a lot of hostility from the public by coming forward. And I think it's only fair to warn people about that.
Yeah. One of the things I'm finding in a lot of, not only in younger journalists, but especially in younger journalists and in our graduate journalism students at Columbia, is that the conversation has changed a little bit. 10 or 20 years ago, we spent a lot of time convincing journalists that, yes, you should pay attention to the kinds of issues that you're raising now and to come up with a thoughtful, sensitive way of interviewing. And there's been a big generational shift in consciousness around the place of trauma in the world, and particularly around gender-based and other identity-based violence, right? And I'm finding that many younger reporters are now worried, with a kind of a capital W, about whether interviewing survivors at all is automatically re-traumatizing, automatically imposing unfair emotional labor, and how to justify it, how to think through it. What would you say to folks who have that concern? I'm terrified of re-traumatizing people, and it's just not fair to ask someone to relive their experience.
By the way, I encounter the same worry among the residents that I supervise. So it's a widespread concern. It's a legitimate concern. But it's certainly not automatically going to be re-traumatizing. I think informed consent is a big part of the story. It's all about the alliance between the interviewer and the interviewee. And in fact, the interview can be very therapeutic and very helpful. But I think it's useful to be very clear about the goals of the person you're interviewing, what that person wants to get out of this interview, your goals, and the benefits and risks. And we talk about that, of course, with patients when we talk about the risks and benefits of treatment. And I think you can be similarly straightforward and transparent with people you interview for journalistic purposes, and including, what we talked about a little earlier, the benefits, both of the benefits they contribute to society, and also the benefits they can possibly gain by gaining more public support, and also the risks in terms of, this is a deeply contested issue And, not everyone is going to respond the way they would hope. And are they prepared for that? Can they deal with that? And if they say, oh, if I get a hostile tweet, I'll be crushed. He said, don't do it, because chances are you will get one. But if they say, well, that's their problem, and I'm not going to be intimidated, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to keep anybody else's secrets anymore, then you say, go for it.
I have sometimes found myself wondering, or saying to journalists when they raise these questions, whether we should really be worried about re-traumatizing, or if really with the danger, at least on the journalistic side, but perhaps on the clinical side too, you can tell me, is specifically on what the subject of your book is specifically about: reenacting betrayal, is about reminding people of the ways not only a particular perpetrator, but the whole system, the whole institution, the whole society failed to protect them, let them down, and that everything from showing up on time and keeping those kinds of promises to transparency about motive and outcome and being realistic about expectations, and that is the right container, or I've wondered if that's a better frame than re-traumatizes, worrying about reenacting betrayal rather than re-traumatizing.
I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but it certainly emphasizes your role as the witness.
Mm-hmm.
Robert J. Lifton, who I think of as one of my idols and mentors, and luckily also as a friend, talks about the role of witnessing professionals. And of course, he's talking about mental health professionals, but I think the concept applies equally to journalists, that we're there to tell the world about something the world may not really want to know about. But that is, I kind of, in some ways, a social duty to be truth tellers, and in that way, not to collaborate, not to collude in the ordinary social response to trauma, which is oftentimes to look the other way or to rationalize and excuse the violence.
I think in your book, you lay out a few different specific steps as part of this justice seeking mission that do speak very directly to the work of a number of kinds of listening, of witnessing professionals, including journalists. You talk about acknowledgement, laying out lines of accountability, and most of all, this kind of radical act of listening, of just listening. It struck me that in reading your accounts of survivors' experiences, you were also you're relaying ways in which they may be challenging your own expectations, your own internal cliches, if you will, of what that we all carry about what survivors need and want. What are a few examples of ways in which survivors challenged you over the writing of this in which these encounters challenged your thinking?
Well, some things were counter to stereotype, but were not particularly surprising to me just based on my clinical work. Mm-hmm. But I think they're worth mentioning because I think survivors are often stereotyped as vengeful, that we can't we can't have survivors voices more included in the justice system because they'll just want revenge. They'll be way too punitive. That didn't turn out to be true. They were also not big on forgiveness, which some people recommend as, let's just, move on, forgive and forget. No, they weren't big into punishment. They were not big into forgiveness either. And I do think the thing that surprised me most, although in hindsight it shouldn't have, was that they just weren't that interested in the offender. They really, they wanted limits placed on the offender. They wanted the society to step up and do whatever needed to be done to make sure the offender didn't do that again. But beyond that, they didn't really, a lot of people, they didn't care that much what happened to the offender. As long as they weren't afraid of him anymore. And for some people that meant prison because as one survivor put it to me, I'm still afraid of him. I've seen what he can do, and if he did that to somebody else, I couldn't live with myself. So, and I don't see any other way to prevent him from hurting other people except prison. I hope he's getting some treatment in prison, but that's where he needs to be. Yeah. But beyond that, they never want to see him again. They wished could never think about him again. The people they wanted reconciliation with was the bystanders, the people who they cared about, who they wanted, who they wanted to step up and make amends and apologize, were the bystanders who should have or could have done something but didn't, or who actively colluded with the perpetrator.
You run through, well, and folks, I see there are a few questions in the chat, and by all means, use the Q&A function to steer questions our way, which I'll try to reflect in a moment. There's a lot more you have to say about schemes for restitution, for reparations, other alternatives to purely punitive justice. You talk about, as you just did, about justice that is not centered on the offender's fate, but on the relationship between victims and society, or victims and bystanders. And we can come back to that, but I did want to return to this question of the listening professional before I forget. There has been enormous innovation in the professional world of journalism, in the kinds of stories we tell and who we're listening to. We've had the Me Too movement launched in part by extraordinary reporting on sexual violence by some of the most powerful people in society. There are journalists, Ukrainian journalists, for the first time that I'm aware of in history, investigating accountability for war crimes, war atrocity in real time, a significant change. We have folks reporting on police violence and all kinds of issues involving intimate listening to survivors over and over and over again. How do we take care of ourselves? This is challenging work. You've been doing this challenging work for your whole career. How do we take care of ourselves as listeners to difficult stories?
Well, I would offer the same advice I always offer to clinicians who want to work with trauma, which is don't do it alone. Never do it alone. you can't do it alone. It's too overwhelming and you will burn out. You need your, just like you need your buddies in a hostile environment. You need your buddy system. If you're going to confront the worst things that human beings do to one another, you need to surround yourself with some of the best. And so you need a support system of, and you need to talk with them. You need people whose shoulder you can cry on. And I know in preparation for this, you referenced Dr. Jack Daniels.
Yeah.
I think there has been traditionally in journalism a kind of you got to man up, and so it's okay if you're drunk in a bar to cry over this, but actually it reminds me there was a study once done of guys, and it was all guys, who had survived the sinking of an oil rig in the North Sea off Norway. And they witnessed the drowning of a lot of their buddies. Mm-hmm. And when they were rescued, they were met with a group of clinicians who gave them a handout about what is PTSD, mm-hmm. And a little bit of advice about what to do about your own PTSD. Mm-hmm. And the two bits of advice, most important bits of advice were, A, don't increase your drinking. Yeah. Don't, because alcohol is actually quite a good medicine for PTSD. It makes the hyperarousal go away. It will, you can sleep, but it does have some unpleasant side effects, like addiction and destroying your relationships and things like that. Yeah. And it said, do find someone to talk to. Tell your wife, tell your parents, tell your best friend. Talk about what happened. And they said they re-interviewed the guys a year later. A lot of the guys had this handout, this little flyer, folded up and kept it in their wallets or kept it in their pockets. That had really helped them a lot. And I think it's because it was simple but useful advice.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm going to pass along a question from our friend Shirzan Minwala. Sorry, Shirzan, I don't know if you meant for me to use your name, but comes very particularly out of important research that she has done in the experiences of sexual violence survivors among trafficked women, among forced migrants and refugees, with the media. And she says, I'd be very interested in Judith Herman's perspective about trauma and the capacity for consent. From a mental health perspective, how would you suggest approaching survivors before they've had a chance to recover?
That's a toughie. When people are in the immediate aftermath.
And I should say, because I'm familiar with the work here, the particular situation involves recently trafficked women who are in safety in refugee camps or other settings from formerly ISIS-held territories and similar situations, and who are approached by journalists who've been brought in by human rights organizations in an attempt to tell the world what's happening. How do we think about that?
Well, I think safety is the key. If they are still at risk, if their safety is still very much currently in jeopardy, they're in crisis. And they I mean, I think they're going to experience conflict between their sense of the importance of telling the world
Mhm.
and their own self-protection. I mean, one possibility would be to start with an off-the-record interview
Mhm.
and not and see how that feels to the survivor, and see, does that, exacerbate her PTSD symptoms and mean she can't sleep, she hasn't slept for a week,
Mhm.
you know, or is it actually comforting, which
Mhm.
is another possibility, and what kind of support system does she have in the refugee camp, and so on, what's she going to do right after that interview,
Yeah. Yeah.
so if you've kind of set up that kind of safety net and you can do a little trial interview,
Mhm.
then you could say, okay, that went okay, so now we can do one on the record.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of an extra layer of protection that I can think of.
Mhm. And it may be that the human rights organizations that are facilitating these relationships can be thinking about these questions too, so that it's not just a kind of rushed
And
encounter,
they can
right?
also be offering things like support groups.
Yeah.
There's a very nice model um, uh, of support groups for refugee women um, by a psychologist, I believe she is, in um, Illinois, I think University of Illinois, named Mary Bunn. That it's called Sharing Stories Eases Pain. And I think that model has been replicated in a number of human rights settings. I know the Center for Victims of Torture has support groups for refugee women in places like Jordan. And uh, uh, so it's worth thinking about, not just food, clothing, and shelter, but also social support
Yeah.
when you're dealing with frontline work with refugees.
Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly think there is this very, as you said right at the top of your answer, just a very tough tension between the urgency of alerting the world and the very difficult state that recent survivors may be in. There are a couple of different questions in the chat that ask variations on what about those situations in which justice of any kind seems, or accountability of any kind seems so elusive. There's one question from a clinician who has worked 3 decades of survivors of conflict where people never get any legal justice, whether in The Hague or their own countries. There are
Uh-huh.
people in the room from Northern Ireland where lack of accountability has in some ways become baked into a peace process. There's an awful lot of injury in the world, and this includes a lot of very intimate sexual violence for which justice seems fleetingly elusive. How do we use your model in a world that so often seems to bring impunity rather than any kind of accountability?
Well, I think in that sense, if you envision justice as beginning with acknowledgement by the community, and uh, holding, and repairing the harm as following on, you can at least get partial justice through that first step of social acknowledgement. And that doesn't, I mean, I think one of the big successes, for example, of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was based very consciously on a restorative justice model, in which amnesty was traded. I mean, it was a part of the negotiated settlement that amnesty for perpetrators was granted in exchange for acknowledgement, for confession. But in fact, the centering of the Truth Commission was on survivors. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the big innovations under the leadership of Archbishop Tutu, compared to, say, other truth commissions from countries emerging from civil war or dictatorship, was that the victim's testimony was centered and broadcast live throughout the country on radio. People didn't have access to print media or television for the most part, but they had access to radio. And broadcasting the live testimony of survivors, mm-hmm. day in and day out, with the compassionate acknowledgement of the Truth Commission, at least got that first step done. And so you don't find in South Africa, I believe, you don't have the kind of lost cause idealization of the Confederacy that we have. You don't have a all-time best-selling movie like Gone with the Wind, saying basically the Confederacy was benign, and we civilized these savages, and we all of that. You don't have that kind of revanchist apartheid ideology running rampant in South Africa. The reconciliation part didn't work out because there was no accountability for the perpetrators, and there was no reparation for the harm. But the truth part, I think, got out there, and that was at least a better form of justice than what we've been able to achieve, say, in the United States for slavery.
Do you think, and I might ask you to think about your own profession, even as I'm thinking about mine. My colleague, Demi Ryder, who's a journalist based in the UK, asks in the chat if there's a way that the pursuit of justice, if it's articulated that way, can maybe help address burnout in trauma-facing professions, that the failure of clinical work to get results at an individual level, or the failure of journalism sometimes to be equal to stopping a war, can be enormously corrosive mm-hmm. for professionals.
Yes.
How do you think about that?
Well, I think the pursuit of justice can bring people into connection with others who share their outrage mm-hmm. and who are trying to make the world better. Mm-hmm. And that is the fact that we don't always succeed, or even often succeed, mm-hmm. Is, a question of the problem of evil and the problem of human nature. It's one of the eternal questions.
And it's a problem of tyranny, which you shape the first part of your book as about tyranny, and tyranny is all about power that doesn't give itself up very easily.
No, that will never give itself, that power that will go to any lengths to preserve its dominance. And we witness that all the time. And, so I like to quote my mama because she was a psychologist named Helen Locke Lewis. She's one of the founders of Division 39 of the American Psychoanalysis. And she was also very much a political activist in her day. Mm-hmm. And one of her pearls was, activism is the antidote to despair. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. So it's not just about winning, it's about fighting the good fight.
That reminds me of something else I wanted to ask you. There's a lot of concern, certainly in journalism now and in society, about how the stories, who gets to tell the stories of survivors or the stories of trauma surviving communities, particularly around, again, gender, race, sexuality, other historically abused communities. In thinking about the work of listening that you do, where does identity, our own identity, survivors' identity, how do those play together, and how can we think through this conundrum of desiring to be a just storyteller, yet asking, are we in fact entitled to do it at all? I think this is about justice in narrative in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you see that, I mean, part of it is just about one's ability to empathize and put oneself in the shoes of the other person. And, a lot of times we get requests, I want to see a person of color as a therapist, or I want to see a gay man as a person, a therapist, or I want to see a woman, because I don't think I don't trust that someone who doesn't share that identity will get it. And, we try to accommodate those requests when we can. One of the wonderful things we used to have at Cambridge Hospital, which is, a public sector safety net hospital, in psychiatry, we had a Spanish speaking team, a Portuguese speaking team, a Haitian Creole team, an African American team, an Asian team that spoke a number of different major Asian languages. We had a gay and lesbian focused team. And those were all, attempts to really match people with people who they felt would get it. On the other hand, sometimes that was not possible to accommodate. And sometimes it was a wonderful experience for a patient to have a therapist from a different background who did get it, and who, and it really sort of broadened their sense of hope that, that other bystanders could be allies. So there's arguments to be made on both sides. I think, that's one of the reasons, for example, that when we run groups for survivors, our stage 1 and stage 2 groups are all about, having homogeneous groups.
Mhm.
People have had a similar, but for stage 3, when people are kind of thinking more expansively about present and future, we don't restrict them to trauma survivors, because the whole point is that you can connect with people in a wider community, and there's all kinds of suffering in the world, and people can bond across some of those differences. So I think there's arguments to be made in both directions. You certainly, you don't want to get into cultural appropriation and exploitation, but you also don't want to imagine that only a woman can tell a woman's story, or only a Black person can tell a Black person's story. That's simply not. I think there are plenty of examples of counterexamples. So,
And I think, and tell me if this is your experience, but it seems to me that as listeners and storytellers in our different professions, we're always managing proximity and distance, and some kind of combination of
right.
closer or further identity, further or closer distance, and
Yeah.
that's actually part of the interesting challenge, isn't it? No matter how much you identify with someone or with a set of experiences, having some distance is part of what makes you a listener, and that sometimes being an outsider, if you're a survivor, may find it easier to tell their story to an outsider who doesn't carry internal stigma. There's a lot of ways in which our own proximity and distance is a complicating factor, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or for example, with some of our um, refugee survivors from, say, Central America, they don't necessarily want someone from the same country, because first of all, the refugee community is small, and there may be one, or someone who knows someone who, there may not be sufficient degrees of separation. And also, what side was this other person on in the Civil War?
Yeah.
So you can't just automatically assume
And
that,
that, and that can be a multi-generational consciousness too. It's not just
absolutely
about individual experience. Let me ask you one other thing, which is fairly broad, but also will maybe return to the core issues of everybody: truth and repair, how trauma survivors envision justice. Particularly maybe on the ground of gender violence and patriarchy, but more broadly too. You're making this argument for survivor-driven accountability and acknowledgement and justice at a time when it's pretty easy to look at the world and say things are headed in a not good direction, in which we have impunity for war crimes and rising tyranny, rising authoritarianism in different societies, in which there's a growing movement of global oligarchs who are exempting themselves from all normal systems of taxation and legal accountability, in which
not to mention funding all the
that's right, and which there's a lot of complicated tyrannical behavior going on, and in which indeed many of the gains of the women's movement and the gains of other civil rights movements within the US, but globally too, often look as if the tide is going out. It's in retreat. As you've been listening to survivors for this project and in articulating this vision of justice, how have you maintained a kind of focus on the possible on this forward-looking vision at a time when so many rights seem in retreat?
Well, I think, well, two things. One is, there's really different versions of the same idea. One of the little pamphlets I read back in the 70s when I was having my own consciousness raised was by a British psychologist named Juliet Mitchell, who went on to write a book called Psychoanalysis and Feminism. But this was just a little 35-cent newsprint pamphlet put out by New England Free Press. It was called Women, the Longest Revolution. And it was kind of a memo to her brothers on the left that liberating women was not just a matter of liberating the working class, because it wasn't just about women whereas the working class was oppressed in the domain of production. Mm-hmm. Women were oppressed in 4 domains: production, reproduction, sex, and child care, child rearing. Mm-hmm. And that gains in any domain could be that women's liberation required gains in all 4 domains, and gains in one could be countered by losses in another. And so this is why women's liberation was going to be the longest revolution. So fast forward to someone like Tarana Burke, who was really the founder of Me Too, and who comes directly out of the American Civil Rights Movement, because as a Harlem teenager, she was recruited to be trained as a community organizer by basically an organization that was an offset, an shoot of Freedom Summer, of the Civil Rights Movement, and had to deal with the sexual exploitation that went on within that movement. Mm-hmm. But when the Dobbs decision came down from the people I like to call our Ayatollahs, right, and the handmaid, right. See, women aren't automatically allies, you see. She said, basically, don't mourn, organize. Mm-hmm. She said, this is a long struggle.
And I think that essentially is the call that you are making in Truth and Repair. You're proposing that this search for survivors' justice is integral to this longest revolution.
Yeah. And whether you're coming at it from the perspective of human rights or a democracy movement or anti-racism or wherever you're trying to save the planet, wherever you're starting, that's the fight you're fighting. So,
and that, I think, seems as good a place to end as any. Thank you, all the people who zapped questions our way. There were many more than we were able to get to, all of them interesting. Thank you, Zan Strumfeld and Kate Black and Crystal Grove from the Dart Center team for keeping us alive in cyberspace. And Judy, thank you on behalf of me, the Dart Center, but also the global community of journalists who are trying to carry the lessons of your work forward in our profession and answer the clarion call you've made in your book. Everybody buy this book. It is wonderful. It is accessible. It won't take you that long to read. It's a marvelous piece of work that I believe is going to influence many people's thinking for many years to come.
Thank
Judith
you
Herman,
so much. It's been a good conversation. Thank you.
so long, folks. Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.